All right, so we've got a ton of articles here about Australian politics, and
Yeah.
it seems like all anyone can talk about is whether or not Albanese is going to call an early election.
Yeah.
And all this stuff about the economy just seems to be making things even more, I don't know,
Yeah.
intense, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We're focusing mainly on this article, 3 Reasons for Albo to Go Early,
Right.
by Anthony Galloway and Jennifer Duke. It's from the Political Capital section. So
Sure.
what's your take on all of this?
Well, it's definitely not every day that you see an Australian prime minister call an early election,
Right.
especially this early into their term.
Yeah.
But this article really does lay out a strong case for why Albanese might actually be thinking about it.
Okay.
It's like this big political chess game
Okay.
where every single move is influenced by the economic forecasts and also just like all this talk about public opinion shifting.
Yeah. So let's break down these 3 reasons that the article talks about.
Okay.
It seems like the economic outlook isn't exactly sunshine and rainbows right now.
Definitely not.
Delight Access Economics is predicting what they're calling a budget bust-up.
Right.
I don't know. That doesn't sound too good to me.
No, it doesn't sound too good.
So is that kind of the main thing that's pushing Albanese toward this early election?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
Imagine having to deliver a budget that shows the country's finances in such a bad state.
Yeah.
Like, that's not exactly a winning campaign strategy, is it?
No, not at all.
This budget bust-up, like they call it,
Yeah.
basically means that the government is spending way more than it's taking in,
Right.
which just leads to a bigger deficit.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely not the kind of news you want to give voters,
No, correct.
especially right before an election.
Like before an election, exactly.
It's like trying to bake a cake and realizing you don't have enough flour. It's not going to work out.
Going to turn out well, no.
So is that the thinking? Albanese calls an early election and maybe avoids having to actually deal with this, like, budget disaster.
Yeah. I mean, that's one way to look at it.
Okay.
He could avoid that whole conversation.
Yeah.
Just campaign on all these promises of a brighter future.
Yeah.
But it's a gamble, for sure.
Right.
He'd be running for office when things are really uncertain economically.
Uh-huh.
That could really backfire.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The article also talks about the Reserve Bank and the possibility of them cutting rates.
Mm-hmm.
That happened a lot during the pandemic, didn't it?
It did, yeah.
So could that also be a factor in Albanese's decision?
Absolutely, because those rate cuts can really boost the economy.
Oh, okay.
And people are definitely feeling the cost of living right now.
Right, yeah.
So it would help with that, which is what voters care about.
Yeah.
But there's a twist.
Okay.
The article mentions this economist, Lucy Ellis from Westpac. She's saying, and other economists are saying it too, that we might not actually see those rate cuts we were expecting. They're now saying the first one might not come until after the last possible election date, which is in May.
Wow. So that means no matter when the election happens,
Right.
Albanese won't be able to benefit from that kind of like economic upswing that comes with a rate cut.
Exactly. It's like hoping for rain during a drought.
Yeah.
It just might not come and you need it most.
Yeah, that definitely complicates things.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got this economic uncertainty, these rate cuts that might not even happen.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, the article points out that labor's support seems to be going down in the polls.
Right. The polls are always a bit of a headache for politicians.
Yeah, I bet.
Looks like Albanese's popularity's taken a bit of a hit.
Yeah, and they talk about a few controversies that might be contributing to that.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Like that whole thing about his expensive house.
Oh, right.
And then there was that Qantas upgrades thing.
Uh,
The article says these things have kind of tarnished his image.
Right. That whole relatable battler
Yeah.
thing that people like about him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Voters want someone they can relate to.
Yeah.
Someone who understands their problems.
Mm-hmm.
So those controversies might not be huge on their own,
Yeah.
but together they could make him seem less trustworthy.
So we've got these economic worries, no rate cuts in sight, and his popularity is dropping.
It's not looking great.
It seems like everything's pointing towards an early election.
It's a lot for him to handle, that's for sure.
It really is.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
Even though there's all this pressure to call an early election,
Yeah.
the article mentions that some of his own senior cabinet colleagues are telling him to be careful.
Interesting.
They're worried that if he rushes into an election, it could backfire.
How so?
Well, they think it could lead to a hung parliament.
Oh, okay.
Or even worse, the coalition could win under Peter Dutton.
For our listener, what exactly is a hung parliament?
So it's when no single party wins a majority of seats in the House of Representatives.
Okay.
which basically means it's really hard to get anything done because nobody has enough votes to pass laws.
Got it.
Yeah.
So basically they're saying that calling an early election might actually make things worse for labor.
Exactly. They'd rather see him wait things out a little bit
Yeah.
and hope things get better before he absolutely has to face the voters.
I see. But waiting also has its own risks, right?
Oh, definitely.
What if the economy gets even worse while he's waiting?
Yeah, it's a tough call.
Yeah.
It's a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
That's a good way to put it.
So does he gamble on an early election and risk losing his majority?
Right.
Or does he try to hang in there and just hope things improve?
That's a real nail biter.
It really is. And it's not just about politics, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about what direction the country's going to go in.
Exactly. The policies and priorities that are decided now will have a huge impact on Australia's economy and society for years to come.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So let's put ourselves in Albanese's shoes for a minute.
Okay.
All these economic worries, all these political calculations, what would you prioritize if you had to make this decision?
What do you think is most important?
We'll explore this more and get into some other interesting parts of this article after a quick break. All right, so we've covered the main points about this possible early election, but the article also mentions some other interesting stuff that I thought we could dive into.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They could add another layer to this whole political scene in Australia.
Right. And even though they might seem a bit random at first glance, they actually all connect back to these big ideas of transparency, accountability, and, public trust, which is really important during any election.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's this whole controversy about what they call exclusive economic data and accusations of plagiarism in journalism, which sounds kind of like a movie or something.
Right. It's kind of dramatic.
Yeah.
So basically, you've got these economists saying that journalists are straight up stealing their charts and graphs.
Oh, wow.
And then passing them off as their own. And yeah, it might seem kind of petty.
Yeah.
But it really highlights how much pressure there is to be the first to report on something.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to economic news, which, as we've been talking about, is a big part of this whole election story.
Right, because if voters feel like they're not getting the real story about the economy, that could definitely affect how they vote.
Exactly.
And it kind of makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes in the media, too.
Oh, for sure. And then there's this whole thing with the deputy prime minister being sued by his former chief of staff.
Yeah, that's right. They mentioned that. Something about politicians using those disappearing message apps.
Yeah, that's a big concern when it comes to transparency.
Right, because they were saying it could affect those freedom of information requests.
Exactly, those FOI requests.
Yeah, just for our listener, FOI requests basically give people access to government information.
Right. It's all about keeping things open and accountable.
Yeah, so if government officials are using these apps where messages disappear, it could be like they're hiding stuff from the public.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
Exactly.
How can you figure out what happened if important information is gone?
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you question if the government is really being transparent, especially with an election coming up.
Exactly. And speaking of tricky situations,
Yeah.
the article also talks about Australia's response to those arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court for Israeli leaders.
Yeah, that sounds really complicated.
It is. Australia is trying to do the right thing by international law, but also maintain good relationships with other countries.
Yeah.
They highlight this carefully worded response from Penny Wong, the foreign minister.
Right.
She basically says that Australia supports the International Criminal Court,
Right.
but also understands that this is a very sensitive issue.
So it sounds like they're trying not to take sides, which I guess makes sense in this situation.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
Oh, there were also some smaller things in the article that I found interesting.
Oh, like what?
Like that thing about more high-paying jobs being created in the government.
Oh, right.
Which seems to be causing some debate.
Yeah, that makes sense considering everything we talked about with the budget. Some people are saying, are these extra high-level positions really necessary?
Yeah.
Or is it just a waste of taxpayer money?
It all comes down to priorities, right?
Exactly. If the government is strapped for cash,
right,
every dollar has to be spent wisely.
And then there's that whole thing about the upcoming media reforms package.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
It's supposed to address that power imbalance between traditional media and these big tech companies like Meta.
Right. The old media versus new media battle.
That's a pretty big deal, especially with the election coming up.
Absolutely. The way people get their news has changed so much,
Yeah.
and these reforms could really change how Australians stay informed,
Mm.
which could then affect how they vote.
Right.
The article even mentions the possibility of a new tax on these tech giants, which would definitely make the economic situation even more complicated.
It seems like everything is connected.
It is. The economy, the media, all these concerns about transparency,
Yeah.
they all tie into this upcoming election.
Right. And with Parliament wrapping up for the year,
Mm-hmm.
the government's actions are going to be under a microscope. It's like the last part of a play
Oh, yeah.
where everything comes together and it all leads up to the big finish.
That's a good way to put it.
And then we can't forget about the Reserve Bank.
Right.
They've got one more meeting this year. Their decision on interest rates is going to be a big deal. Exactly. Because like we said before, whether they cut rates or not could really impact how people are feeling about the economy heading into the election.
And then there's the whole thing with Peter Dutton and the cost of his nuclear power proposal.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
The article says he might wait to release those numbers until after Parliament is done for the year.
Which would probably make people think he's trying to hide something.
Yeah, especially those who aren't fans of nuclear power.
It's a classic political move.
Delay that potentially controversial information until it's less likely to make headlines?
But at least with the Greens agreeing to Labor's Help to Buy scheme, it looks like those rumors about a double dissolution election are over.
Oh, right. For our listener, a double dissolution election is when both houses of parliament are dissolved
Yeah.
and everyone has to run for re-election.
Yep.
It doesn't happen very often in Australia.
Yeah.
Usually only when things are totally gridlocked between the House and the Senate.
So the Greens cooperating on this might avoid a double dissolution election.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean things are going to be smooth sailing for Albanese.
Definitely not.
There's always something going on in Australian politics.
Always a new twist or turn.
It's definitely never boring, is it?
That's what makes it so interesting to follow.
I totally agree. So we've covered a lot here.
Yeah.
From the possibility of an early election to all these worries about the economy and transparency and even a little bit of international diplomacy.
A lot to take in.
It really is. But that's why I think this deep dive is so helpful. Yeah, it's a lot, but I think that's why this deep dive has been so helpful. We're taking all of this information and trying to, figure it all out.
Right.
Especially with this whole decision about the election.
So basically, Albanese is in this really tough spot.
Yeah.
He's got all this pressure on him, economic problems, the polls going down, disagreements within his own party.
And we can't forget about that budget bust-up.
Right, that's hanging over everything.
It's almost like he's being asked to fix a bomb while everyone's arguing about how to do it.
It's a good analogy.
If he calls an early election, it's like he's saying, I'm the guy who can handle this economic mess. But then he's got a campaign with that whole budget bust-up thing hanging over his head.
Exactly, which is a big risk.
So damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Totally.
What if he delays the election and the economy gets even worse?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Voters are already feeling the pressure, with prices going up and all that. If things look even bleaker, people might lose faith in the government.
Right, and then those rate cuts that everyone was hoping for,
Yeah.
it doesn't look like they're going to happen anytime soon.
So wouldn't delaying the election just mean that things keep getting worse for voters?
It's a tough situation, and, those rate cuts are just a temporary fix anyway.
Sure.
Fixing the economy for good requires more than just adjusting interest rates.
Right.
It means making some tough choices that some people might not like.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It might help a little, but it's not going to fix the problem.
Exactly.
So is Albanese better off calling an early election now before things get even worse? Or should he try to buy some time and hope for a miracle?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
If he goes for an early election, he can at least control the narrative a bit.
How so?
He can frame it as a choice between him and, what might happen with the coalition under Dutton.
Okay.
But he's going to the polls with some baggage.
Yeah, a struggling economy and low approval ratings don't exactly scream, "Re-elect me."
Right, and that's where those disagreements within the Labor Party come into play.
Yeah.
Some people think he needs to make a bold move, even if it's risky, like an early election, to regain some momentum.
Okay.
But then others are worried that rushing into an election will backfire.
Yeah, we talked about that fear of a hung parliament or even losing to the coalition.
Exactly. So it's like he's in this high-stakes poker game, trying to figure out when to play his cards.
Does he go all in with an early election or hold out and hope for a better hand?
That's what makes all of this so interesting.
Yeah.
The future of Australia really depends on this decision.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is. Will Labour continue their plans, or will the coalition come back and change everything?
It's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
We've talked about the economy, the politics, what the public is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It all comes down to this one big choice.
What do you think Albanese should do?
What would you do if you were in his shoes?
It's a question worth thinking about.
We've only scratched the surface today, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some insight into what's going on in Australian politics right now.
Things are constantly changing.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with.
So stay informed, read the articles we mentioned, and most importantly,
Yeah.
don't stop thinking critically about these issues.
Politics is rarely straightforward,
No.
but that's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly.
So keep exploring these topics, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the things that matter most.
Until next time.
Happy diving.